actually did not learn about Greenwood until 1996. My mother moved here from a small border town called Yuma, Arizona in the late 60s, and in the late 70s, she worked as a caretaker for an elderly white man who mumbled about the shootings and the fire. And she asked her in-laws, my grandmother and her other in-laws, what was he talking about? What happened here in Tulsa? And my grandmother said, look, we don't talk about that around here, and don't go asking anybody about it. And as a young girl sitting nearby listening to that conversation, it raised my curiosity briefly, but I never thought about it again until I came to the Greenwood Cultural Center in the early part of '96, and I saw the photographs for myself, went on a guided tour and learned the history, and then I returned to work here. And later that year, about 6 months later, I began as an office assistant. So I have been here for 28 years. I started as an office assistant, and part of my job included giving guided tours. And at that time, local historian and educator Eddie Faye Gates was giving tours. Kevin Ross was her photographer. And so I would follow behind Eddie Faye Gates as she gave tours of the Greenwood Cultural Center, the Mabel B. Little Heritage House, and the Greenwood District. And it was also during the time that they were identifying survivors as part of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission's investigation and report, as it was called at that time. And so they were able to identify, I believe, nearly 100 survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And they were able to record many of their stories. And so that's how I learned the history from primarily was Eddie Faye Gates. So Tulsa is very segregated. I grew up in a Tulsa that was very segregated. So growing up in North Tulsa, our church, our school, everything was in the same little neighborhood. It wasn't unusual for us to see Ku Klux Klan members periodically near our home. On the top of a little hill was a place where they would gather. So we would see them from time to time riding down the street in full gear. That wasn't at all unusual. And then when I was a child, I was at my grandmother's house, who lived in Beaufort Colony, it's out near Sand Springs, west of Tulsa. My grandmother was a very religious woman. She was considered the mother of the church in Beaufort Colony. And we'd go there to spend the weekends with her from time to time. And one night, we hear a knock at the door, a loud knock on the door. And my grandmother gets up to go to the door to see who it is, and I follow behind her. And when my grandmother opens the door, there is a sea of white robes. Ku Klux Klan members in full gear with torches. And behind her home, it's an open field. There's a lot of, and then a lot of trees. And they begin shouting and saying that they were looking for someone in particular, and they knew he was in my grandmother's home, and they were going to come in and get him. He needed to come out. And my grandmother said, there's nobody here by that name. I don't know who you're talking about. And they continued to say that she was lying. We're going to come in and burn your house down. And so she said, there's nobody here but me and my grandchildren. And then a white man stepped out of the crowd, and he said, that's Mother Brown. And if Mother Brown says there's no one in her house, then I believe her. There's no one in her house. And so they began to, mumble and slowly faded back into the wilderness, the trees and the bushes. And I realized that some of those Ku Klux Klan members knew my grandmother personally, and that my grandmother knew some of them. And although she realized that they had came to her house, and they were willing to be violent, they were looking for someone to harm, that these are the people that she would interact with the following day when she went to the grocery store or to church or wherever she was going. These are people that she could potentially interact with. And she had to live with the knowledge that they were Ku Klux Klan members, that they were racist, and that they hated her simply because of the color of her skin. And that reminds me of the aftermath of the Tulsa Race Massacre, when thousands of white people descended on the Greenwood district, killing innocent men and women and burning their homes to the ground. And then the following day, they went back to their businesses and their homes and their jobs as if nothing had happened. There were actual ministers who were involved, who claimed that this was their fault, that blacks had brought this on themselves. And there were black people who survived the massacre who knew whites who were responsible for what had taken place in the Greenwood district, and yet they couldn't do anything about it. There was no justice to be found. Many of the people that they looked to for protection during the Tulsa Race Massacre were your police officers and city officials and elected officials. And we have a roster of Ku Klux Klan members from that time period. And it's amazing to see the names and the positions that they held within the community on the roster for the Ku Klux Klan. Very blatantly and proud Ku Klux Klan members. And we understand that in many ways, not much has changed. That those feelings that racism has been passed down from generation to generation, oftentimes, and that racism still shows itself. As you said, it is part of the structure of American government. It's institutional, and we see that in a number of different ways. Personally, when I found myself pregnant at 18 with my first child, I didn't know what to expect being pregnant. When my water broke out at Woodland Hills Mall, I didn't even know what was happening. But my father took me to the hospital, Oklahoma State University Osteopathic Hospital. I was 7 months pregnant. They put me in a hospital room and they told me that it was really too early for my child to be born and that they would try to keep me from going into labor, even though my water had broke. And there was a nurse, I didn't see a doctor, and the hospital was a teaching hospital, so a lot of students. And I laid there for hours, eventually by myself. My father stayed with me, and then they said, well, you're gonna have to leave the room. So I was there by myself, and they had told me that, you know, if you go into labor, you need to let us know. If you start feel like you're having contractions or pains, you need to let us know so that we can give you the medication that would prevent you from going into labor. And so I continued to lay there, and I noticed that there was an older white nurse that would come and check on me from time to time. And then she would go and check on the pregnant woman in the room next to mine. And the way that she spoke to me was completely different from the way that she would spoke to the woman next door to me. Her tone was different. She seemed to be very impatient. She was very cold and calculated. And I remember that I began to have pains. And I told her when she came in, I said, I'm having some pain. And she threw my legs apart and examined me. And she said, there's nothing going on with you. Call me when you're ready to have this baby. And I thought, when I'm ready to have this baby, but I thought I'm not supposed to go into labor. You're trying to help me prevent you're trying to prevent me from going into labor. But I'm a young girl, and I've been taught to respect medical professionals, and you respect older people. And so I didn't speak up. And then I began to time these contractions, and I was in a great deal of pain, and I told them again, and nothing happened. I still hadn't seen a doctor. Eventually, someone came in, and another nurse, and I had begun to crown. And they took me to the delivery room, and I gave birth to my first child, a little girl named Maria. And even though it's been 32 years, it hurts me to this day. I gave birth to my daughter. They hadn't had time to give me any type of pain medication or anything. I had her naturally. And about as soon as she was delivered, the doctor came in. My doctor, his name was Dr. Nimco, came in. And there were only students there that had delivered my baby. And I remember them taking her over to a sink, and their backs were towards me. And I remember it being really quiet, but I had never given birth before. I'd never seen anyone give birth before, so I didn't know how unusual that was. And then until my doctor sat at my bedside, and he looked at them and he said, "Does she know?" And they said, "Yes, she knows." And I said, "Do I know what?" And they said, "Well, your baby didn't make it. She didn't make it." And it just blew my mind that I felt so much could have been done to help me. So much could have been done to prevent my daughter from dying. And I truly believe that had I not been a woman of color, a young woman of color, unmarried, that my care would have been different. The way she looked at me with disgust, the difference in the way she spoke with me compared to the way she spoke to the white woman in the room next to me, I will forever believe that I simply did not receive the care or the compassion and respect that I deserved, just as a human being. And then throughout time, when people visit Tulsa, I have older siblings that visit Tulsa that weren't raised here, and they'll say, people are so racist here. And I think so much of it we've just become accustomed to. So when people begin to follow you in the stores, when you walk into a store, when they ask if they can help you repeatedly, as if they're watching you and they're monitoring you, when someone steps in front of you in line and doesn't even make eye contact, as if you aren't standing there waiting to be helped as well. There's just numerous instances where I know personally I have experienced racism and inequalities, and it is just so saddening that oftentimes we don't even notice it or realize it because we've become so accustomed to it. I feel a connection to the history. When I started working here, the last thing I ever envisioned myself doing was working in an office setting. I had no interest in giving tours or in working in an office, and I didn't plan to be here for very long. But as I would follow Eddie Faye Gates and Kevin Ross, and I would listen to the survivors tell their stories, and the fact that for decades they hadn't shared this history with anyone. We weren't taught the history of Black Wall Street or the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre in our history lessons in schools here in Tulsa, where we had Black history lessons, where we had Black educators and we attended predominantly Black schools. No one talked about it. So I met survivors who had carried this burden, they carried this weight on their shoulders for decade after decade, never speaking about it. And now people were committed to sharing this history, acknowledging the history of the massacre and Black Wall Street, and helping bring their stories to light. And this, when I came, this effort was in its very early stages. And many of them were telling their stories for the very first time. But listening to their stories and reading the narrative and seeing the photographs, it made me so angry. But it also made me committed to being a part of telling their stories. Not just telling the history as it's been proven and as it's been documented, but telling the stories that the survivors have shared with us, because their stories, their remembrances are their truth and thereby, therefore, our truth, right? So I connected to the history because this is where I was born and raised. And it's not just Tulsa's history. This is a part of our nation's history because this is where our nation's worst race massacre occurred. But I'm also connected because as I began to research my family's history, I discovered that my great grandfather was one of the, if not the first, African-American male to own a barbershop in Wellington, Kansas. In the late 1800s, he owned a barbershop, and there are newspaper articles that speak of his barbershop and just his family in general. And some of the newspaper articles go back to the late 1800s. And he owned not only his barbershop, but he owned land. He owned his home. He owned other properties in Wellington in the late 1800s. What we were taught is that most African Americans were poor, uneducated, 12 kids in a one-bedroom shack, and that simply wasn't the case for many African Americans. They were well-educated. They were successful. They were courageous. And I think about everything that he had to have endured as a man of color, opening a barbershop, buying land, owning property, the racism that he had to endure, as did the founders of Black Wall Street, the entrepreneurs that built their businesses here in the early 1900s. So I'm connected to telling the stories that have not been told, that portray us in a way we're not portrayed in our typical history lessons, in your typical textbooks, telling the story of us as courageous, as successful, committed, loving ourselves, loving who we are as a people, and loving one another so much that we were willing to support each other and help each other to build and to grow. I do think that there is a generation of young people who, and this is what I've been told on more than one occasion, because as a Black woman and as a mother of Black sons, I want to protect them. And generally speaking, want to protect our young people. So I don't want them, there's a part of me that doesn't want them to speak up. I want them to be safe. I want them to comply. I want them to be respectful so that they can make it home safe. Just do whatever you have to do to make it home safe. But there's this younger generation of people who are saying, I can't listen to you anymore. You guys tell us to pray about it, and you've been praying for decades. You've been singing old church hymns for decades. You've been marching it for decades, and this is how far we've gotten. There has to be something else that has to happen, because evidently what has been happening hasn't gotten us the results. And they have this energy that has to be directed some way, right? There has to be a way that they can be active and they can feel like they are doing something and they are involved in changing things, because they are simply not content with doing things the way that generations before them did them. There's a part of me that says, find the safest way to rebel. If there's a safe way to rebel, write letters, make phone calls, which, that all of that plays a part. But I think there's also a time when we have to stand up. when you have to be counted and you have to make sure that your voice is heard. But for every person, you have to decide what activism looks like for you, and how active you want to be. And I also too believe in prayer. I believe in the power of prayer, but I also believe that in the Bible, God sometimes led his people to war, and he told them that they would be victorious because he was on their side. So there are times when we should pray about it and put it in God's hands, and then there are other times when we should be ready to go to war.